A dispute between an admiral and an army general produced what became the most flawless amphibious operation of the Pacific War. Located in the northern Marianas, the island of Tinian lies about 1/500 miles from the Japanese mainland, 100 miles north of Guam, and 3 miles southwest of Saipan. At barely 39 square miles, it had the appearance of a tropical paradise, and over the centuries had passed from Spanish to German control before the Japanese occupied it in 1914 for agricultural use. As the war progressed, the Japanese began fortifying the island because Americans recognized its value as a base for the long-range Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers. Tinian would later serve as the launch point for the atomic strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Although Tinian is best known today for that role, in July 1944, it was simply the latest stepping stone in the American drive toward the Japanese home islands. While the seizure of Saipan was still underway, Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith and the expeditionary forces under his command turned their attention to capturing Tinian, then held by roughly 9,000 Japanese troops. Smith declared that Tinian would become, in his words, the most perfect amphibious operation of the Pacific War. Yet the operation sparked fierce argument among senior American leaders over which beaches to use. Vice Admiral Richmond K. Turner, commander of the Joint Expeditionary Force, favored landing on Yellow Beach on the island's northeastern shore. Rear Admiral Harry W. Hill and Major General Harry Schmidt, responsible for the Northern Attack Force and Northern Landing Troops respectively, argued strongly for White 1 and White 2 beaches at the island's northern tip. Those beaches were narrow, less than 200 yards wide, whereas Amphibious doctrine called for a beach roughly 1,000 yards across to receive a division. Planners estimated White 1 could handle 8 amphibious tractors at once, and White 2 up to 16. Admiral Hill, exasperated, left a meeting with Turner claiming the admiral refused to listen and insisted repeatedly that Smith must submit his landing plan immediately and abandon plans for White Beach. According to Smith, the meeting aboard the USS Rocky Mount produced considerable profanity and set the stage for a head-on clash with Turner. Turner bluntly announced, "Holland, you are not going to land on the White Beaches." Smith snapped back that Turner would have no choice. He could place Smith anywhere he wanted, and that it was Smith who devised the tactical plans. Turner's job was merely to say whether the landings were feasible. Turner insisted it could not be done. 2 divisions could not possibly come ashore on those tiny beaches. Smith countered that Turner's objections stemmed from excessive worry about the safety of his boats. The argument continued for hours as each tried to persuade the other. Turner insisted Tinian Town's beaches were the only sensible choice. Smith retorted that landing at Tinian Town would invite heavy Japanese casualties. Mentioning the impending amphibious reconnaissance of the beaches by the reconnaissance battalion was like waving a red flag before an angry bull. Turner dismissed the recon teams as just a group of Marines, and warned that raising the idea would make others mock Smith as ignorant. Smith shot back that the decision of where to land was his business, and he would fight Turner over it, threatening to appeal to Admiral Raymond A. Spruance of the 5th Fleet and, if necessary, Admiral Chester Nimitz of the Pacific Fleet. In a later letter, Hill wrote that he had never seen Turner so rude and angry. For his part, Turner later described Holland Smith as a fine tactical general and close friend, but Smith viewed Turner as a relentless taskmaster. Combative, energetic, meticulous, and stubborn, hence the nickname Terrible Turner. The immediate resolution of the disagreement came from the Amphibious Reconnaissance Company, led by Captain James L. Jones, the father of future Marine Commandant James L. Jones, Jr., formed at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina in January 1943 and renamed the Amphibious Reconnaissance Company, Amphibious Corps, Pacific Fleet in August 1943. The unit was expanded into a 2-company battalion at Smith's request on April 14, 1944, becoming the VAC Amphibious Reconnaissance Battalion under recently promoted Major James L. Jones. The battalion, together with underwater demolition teams, UDTs 5 and 7, was tasked with a nighttime survey of Tinian's beaches. Their assignment was intricate. Locate obstacles on the shoreline, Measure cliff heights and note vegetation behind the beaches, map the offshore reef and water depths. Determine what vehicles could cross the reef and proceed inland, and assess whether infantry could scale the cliffs without cargo nets or ladders. First Lieutenant Leo B. Shin's Company B, assisted by 12 swimmers from UDT-5 led by famed frogman Lieutenant Draper Kaufman, was assigned to survey the two white beaches, while Captain Silverthorne Jr.'s company, A plus A UDT-7 detachment handled Yellow Beach. Battalion leaders and selected NCOs and corpsmen boarded the USS Gilmer, an APD converted from a World War I four-stack destroyer, on July 8th and steamed along Tinian's western coast to aid navigation for the reconnaissance. Shin explained that the cruise allowed them to study the beaches through binoculars and become familiar with the island's silhouette. The next evening, both reconnaissance companies rehearsed off purple beaches in Mawson Bay with swimmers from UDT-7. It was agreed that the UDTs would conduct the hydrographic reconnaissance while the Marines would examine the beach proper and inland terrain. Shin described how 10 black neoprene 10-man landing craft, LCRs, were launched from the APD at midnight from about 3,000 yards offshore, then towed closer to roughly 1,500 yards from the beach before each swimmer entered the water equipped with an inflatable CO2 life belt, a torch, and a packet of Aviator's yellow emergency dye. The rehearsal went as planned and ended around 0500. The actual reconnaissance was scheduled for the night of July 10-11. Shin said the entire day before was devoted to final planning, familiarizing troops with the plan, and running rehearsals and drills. All available aerial photos and maps of the beaches were analyzed in detail. The recon Marines and frogmen were to be carried by USS Gilmer and USS Stringham to a point about 3,000 yards offshore, where they would launch 10-man rubber boats. Those boats would be towed by ship landing craft with muffled exhausts to about 500 yards off their assigned beaches before being paddled to positions just outside the surf. The first reconnaissance missions were to be executed as covertly as possible to avoid tipping off the Japanese. Strict orders forbade disturbing any mines or obstacles found. Admiral Turner voiced concern about alerting the enemy, and 8 swimmers from Lieutenant Richard F. Burks of UDT-7 and 20 swimmers from Company A were picked by Captain Silverthorne to reconnoiter Yellow Beach at 10:45 p.m. Under an overcast sky that hid the moon, the party moved toward the shore. When the rubber boats were about 500 yards offshore, 2 sharp reports, like rifle shots accompanied by flashes, were heard off the south end of the main Yellow Beach. Major Jones, who had ordered secrecy, directed the boats to head north to gather hydrographic data on the reef. Shortly afterward, there were 2 muffled explosions that sounded like mortars. UDT-7 located several underwater boulders and potholes and noted floating mines in the approaches to the beach. Swimmers reported nearly impassable cliffs of roughly 20-25 feet rising at the edges of the roughly 125-yard wide. Strand Op Marines led by 2nd Lieutenant Donald F. Neff found double apron barbed wire strung across the beach, leaving men pinned at the high water line. Crawling through the wire with only a knife, Neff pushed inland about 30 yards to find an exit, while he could hear Japanese work crews nearby. At one point, he glimpsed 3 sentries on a cliff edge sweeping the sand with flashlights, but they failed to spot him. He discovered that the enemy was constructing defenses precisely where the landing was planned, endured a harrowing time ashore, and then swam back to the rubber boat with his men. Neff led Company A's reconnaissance that night, and was later awarded the Silver Star. Reconnaissance reports from the commander of Task Force 52 led to the decision to confine the assault to White Beaches 1 and 2. Yellow Beach proved to have fairly heavy surf and was judged unsuitable for a division-sized landing because of steep cliffs and narrow exits. Shin organized 2 teams, one for White Beach 1, the northernmost, and one for White Beach 2. A lieutenant who later recalled the beaches estimated them at roughly 60 yards and 160 yards across, separated by a stretch of rocky shoreline. Both Marine squads put off from the Gilmer at about 11:30 p.m. Things went smoothly until the LCRs were cast off and a strong northerly tidal current began carrying both teams to the north. The unit assigned to White Beach 1 failed to reach its intended point and instead grounded on a coral outcrop about 800 yards north. Had that outcrop not checked them, they would have been swept farther into the main channel. The White Beach 2 team, after landing, quickly checked their sector while UDT swimmers combed the offshore waters for hazards. One frogman detail under Lieutenant J.G. George Surin went ashore above the high water line to investigate a tip about mines and found none. Recovering the rubber boats proved difficult because of the northerly current, low scud clouds, and light fog. Several men missed pickup. After hours struggling in the water, some, including PFC Sam Ilford and others such as John Seaburn, and UDT Commander Lieutenant Kaufman, were finally picked up by the APD-converted picket boat USS Dickerson, APD-21, that was patrolling the channel between Tinian and Saipan. Their life jackets, fitted with inflatable bladders, kept them afloat. With only half the mission completed that night, Major Jones ordered Silverthorne's Company A to recheck White Beach 2 the next evening. Plans called for the recon teams to embark on USS Stringham and be retrieved by USS Gilmer. A rigged rubber boat drone carrying a tripod wrapped in wire mesh as a makeshift radar reflector, plus 5 rubber boats loaded with swimmers and paddlers, were to be towed to a point about 900 yards off White Beach. The improvised reflector was necessary because the previous night's failures had been blamed on the Gilmers. Lack of surface radar for guiding the boats. Silverthorne provided 6 swimmer teams, each with an officer and a senior non-commissioned man, while Company B supplied and manned the boats. 12 UDT swimmers accompanied the recon contingent. Launched from roughly 900 yards out and radio directed by the ship using the wire mesh tripod and the steel helmets worn by the men in the LCRs, the force was steered to a position about 100 yards south of White Beach 2 and some 400 yards seaward. To minimize noise, every team entered the water and approached by paddling and swimming, mostly side stroke or breaststroke, with heads kept above water and faces and necks darkened for camouflage. Although sharp coral nicked several swimmers, the reef was deep enough to let them cross without attracting attention. Once ashore, the reconnaissance Marines found no beach obstacles and no signs of Japanese activity. The UDTs examined the surf and reef in front of the beach, while the Marines probed inland. 2 squad members lay exposed on the sand at one point, and a Japanese guard nearly stepped on them, but they were not discovered. The teams completed their tasks and returned on schedule. Silverthorne reported to Rear Admiral Hill that, while narrow, the beaches were free of mines, coral heads, boulders, wire, boat obstacles, or offshore reefs. The surf and landings were level and smooth enough to be compared to a pool table. Hill was convinced. Silverthorne was awarded the Silver Star for his leadership, and the landing force operations officer later praised the reconnaissance battalion and the UDTs for executing an extremely difficult mission almost perfectly, because Vice Admiral Turner had originally rejected Hill's proposal to use the White Beaches. Admiral Spruance convened the senior commanders on the afternoon of July 12th. Rear Admiral Hill and Lieutenant General Smith presented a strong case for the White Beaches, and Turner agreed to adopt the plan. Relief and satisfaction followed quickly among those present. Turner later explained that he had been prepared to accept the White Beaches unless the reconnaissance reports were decisively negative, and he defended his earlier insistence that every possible landing site be thoroughly surveyed before a decision was made. He also noted that, by long-standing practice, he would delay final judgment until the investigations and the main elements of the landing plan were in place. By mid-afternoon on July 24th, the assault elements of Major General Clifton Cates's 4th Marine Division had crossed the White Beaches and taken them with relatively light casualties. The 2nd Marine Division followed over the same beaches the next day. After heavy losses during the Saipan campaign, neither division welcomed another brutal engagement. Over the preceding 18 months, the 2nd Marine Division had been especially hard hit, beginning with Guadalcanal, where roughly 1,000 men were lost to malaria and about 12,000 more were stricken, then later suffering grievous losses at other island fights. In the June-July 1944 Saipan campaign, another 1,300 Marines died and some 5,000 were wounded, while Japanese fatalities in the series of island battles numbered in the tens of thousands. The 4th Marine Division, though newer, had already been blooded in January-February 1944 at Roy Namur in the Marshalls, and had taken heavy casualties, about 6,000 casualties at Saipan with roughly 1,000 killed. This Tinian operation was the first under a new divisional commander and the third major landing for many units in just over 6 months. Because of the drain at Saipan, several 4th Division battalions were severely under strength, their average complement falling from about 880 men to roughly 565, a reduction of over 35%. Major Carl W. Hoffman later recorded in the official history that, despite the losses, the morale of the troops assigned to the Tinian operation remained generally high. The numbers become striking when you remember these Marines had just come off a brutal 25-day engagement and were due to hit enemy shores again after only a 2-week pause. Their response was more a weary shrug and a resigned, "Here we go again," than loud complaints about being sent back so quickly. Admiral Turner made it clear he wanted the Marines to take the island, and Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith was replaced as commander of the V Amphibious Corps by Major General Harry Schmidt, who promised to finish the job in 10 days. It actually required only 9. Rear Admiral Hill ordered a heavy naval bombardment across the island's 5 fire support zones to unsettle the defenders and calm Marine nerves before the assault. Cruisers Cleveland and Louisville and 7 destroyers joined the fire, and the battleships California, Tennessee, both survivors of Pearl Harbor damage, and Colorado struck shore batteries. 2 6-inch coastal guns that threatened the approaches to White Beaches 1 and 2 were knocked out by Colorado's 16-inch salvos, which scored 22 hits. The Japanese counter-battery fire cost the Americans 43 sailors killed and 198 wounded, and the Tennessee later returned to help finish off the coastal defenses. On J-Day, the Tinian equivalent of D-Day, naval fire was halted 3 times so American aircraft could rake roads, rail junctions, pillboxes, gun positions, and the approaches to Tinian town. Nearly 350 Navy and Army planes took part in the strikes, delivering hundreds of rockets and bombs, including napalm and incendiary clusters. The 4th Marine Division was staged in 37 LSTs anchored near Saipan, and after the preliminary bombardment, received water, medical supplies, ammunition, and 3 days' rations. Vehicles and other gear had been preloaded well before the assault. According to a historian, the Marines intended to travel light ashore, no full packs, only a spoon, an extra pair of socks, insect repellent, and emergency items in their pockets. The 4th Marine Division, known as the Assault Division, steamed for Tinian on July 24th. Because the landing strips were narrow, troops came ashore in company, platoon, and squad columns rather than whole battalions abreast. One division commander staged a feint toward Tinian town to pin down defenders. The deception drew a full battalion of the Japanese 50th Infantry Regiment and many men of the 56th Naval Guard into the town's defenses. Confident he had repelled an invasion, the Japanese commander radioed Tokyo claiming he had driven off 100 landing barges, even as the 25th Marines hit White Beach 2 and the 24th Marines assaulted White Beach 1 in 24 LVTs, Amtraks. The entire 2nd Battalion of the 24th was ashore by 08:20 while supporting ships continued to saturate the beaches with rockets and suppressive fire. The troop-laden LVTs faced scattered and ineffective rifle and machine gun fire during the roughly 26-minute run to shore. Some enemy fighters holed up in caves and opened on the first wave, but they were quickly neutralized. Within an hour, the 24th's 1st and 2nd Battalions were ashore on White One and preparing to push inland. Despite intermittent artillery, mortar, and small arms fire, the 2nd Battalion pressed on and by 1600 had reached the western edge of Airfield No. 3 and severed the main road linking Airfield No. 1 with the island's east coast and southern districts. The 1st Battalion ran into stiffer resistance on its left as defenders fired from caves. Flame-throwing tanks were called up, and the Japanese stubbornly held their ground. With the 1st and 2nd Battalions creating a gap, the 24th's 3rd Battalion, held in reserve near the beach, was committed to close it. When the 25th Marines landed at White Beach 2, they came ashore behind an undetected minefield that detonated vehicles. 3 LVTs and a Jeep were blown up, and the mines took roughly 6 hours to clear. Defenders had also booby-trapped beer cases and mementos to maim or kill unwary Marines. Inland, the Americans encountered soldiers of the Japanese 50th Regiment well dug in among ravines, caves, and pillboxes, fighting with machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons. The Marines elected to bypass many of these strong points and reduce them in later operations. Ogata's headquarters, roughly 2.5 miles away, received harassing artillery fire as the enemy tried to disrupt coordination. The landings were chaotic. As Jumping Joe Chambers recalled, "Confusion is inevitable when you first hit the beach and try to get organized. But by dusk, the 2 regiments had consolidated, dug in and formed a crescent-shaped beachhead about 3,000 yards wide along the shore and bulging roughly 2,500 yards inland. On J-Day, the 23rd Marines, held in 4th Division Reserve, suffered from delays that were not enemy action. They were kept on the LSTs for most of the day, and only ordered to load landing craft around 1400. Their regimental commander, Colonel Lace R. Jones, endured severe communications problems and was unable to reach his battalions or division for hours. An LVT he was aboard suffered engine trouble, and it took 7 hours to get it ashore. By the end of the day, despite some units not achieving all of their initial objectives, more than 15,000 Marines were on the ground supported by 4 artillery battalions, 20 half-tracks armed with 75mm guns, 48 medium Sherman tanks, and 15 flame tanks. The beachhead extended nearly a mile inland. Marine losses were comparatively light, about 15 killed and 225 wounded, while Japanese casualties numbered around 438. As one historian put it, considering what could have gone wrong, it was not a bad day's work. With support from the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, the 24th occupied the northern arc of the defensive crescent, while the 25th and elements of the 23rd held the southern sector, the remainder of the 23rd remaining in reserve. Engineer units, special troops, and artillery battalions from the 10th and 14th Marines were emplaced on the beaches behind them, all alert because the Japanese had a reputation for tenacity. American commanders expected a night counterattack, and after darkness fell, the defenders readied to strike. Severed communications forced Ogata to rely on local commanders to mount their own countermeasures. He had earlier ordered that enemy landings be smashed in one blow where rapid movement was impeded. Aware of their numerical inferiority and lack of escape routes, his troops nonetheless vowed to die fighting and to honor the Emperor with their resistance. Around 2230, a Japanese mobile counterattack force and a 900-man battalion of the 135th Infantry, armed with rifles and explosive charges, probed the center of the Marine line opposite the 24th, 2nd, and 3rd Battalions. The Marines alerted their artillery upon detecting the advance. A large ravine running southeast to northwest cut into the western edge of the American position. And as Lieutenant Colonel Chambers later wrote, anyone sensible would have expected the enemy to use such gullies in a counterstroke. Men in his unit reported hearing the Japanese moving and whispering down in the ravine during the night. Around midnight, the attackers struck K Company's sector, hauling 2 75mm howitzers by hand into firing positions and then hammering the Marines until the guns were knocked out. Chambers praised K Company's conduct. Some 150-200 Japanese succeeded in advancing through the ravine toward the beach, whereupon American artillery and supporting weapons were brought to bear to stop the assault. Machine gun and rifle fire erupted as the Japanese struck the rear sectors, tracers and rounds whipping just over our heads. I was about 75 yards from the enemy hitting L Company, and there was nothing I could do to help, Chambers recalled. The main blow concentrated in K Company's sector on the left flank, where Lieutenant Mickey McGuire was firing canister, anti-personnel rounds loaded with large pellets, for close fighting. PFC Alfred J. Daigle and Corporal A. Showers manned a machine gun, and, according to eyewitnesses, poured a deadly cone of fire into the attackers. Beside them lay a dead Japanese officer. The two Marines held their fire until the enemy closed to roughly 100 yards, then opened up as the Japanese charged with grenades and light machine guns yelling banzai. Both Doggle and Showers were found dead, hunched over their weapons the next morning. 251 Japanese bodies were later counted in front of their position. Doggle was awarded the Navy Cross posthumously, and Showers a posthumous Silver Star. Major Robert Y. Neiman's two tank companies arrived just before dawn and were ready for action. When Chambers sent them forward, they returned half an hour later and, shaken, Neiman reportedly said there was no need for tanks. Undertakers were what was needed. He had never seen so many Japanese dead. The 50 caliber machine guns of batteries E and F literally tore the Japanese to pieces, one account said, while the 75mm pack howitzer crews of Battery D, 14th Marines, also played a key role in repulsing the attacks. In all, the Japanese assault against the center of the Marine line exacted a heavy toll. Around 0200, the 1st Battalion, 24th Marines, was struck by an attack of roughly 600 Special Naval Landing Force troops launched from nearby airfield sectors on the left flank. Company A had been hammered so hard that it called for emergency reinforcements from engineers, corpsmen, radio men, and other support personnel. Only about 30 men remained to hold the line. Using 37mm canister rounds, machine guns, rifles, and mortars, and aided by illumination flares that lit up the battlefield, the Marines beat back the attackers. The fight continued until Sherman tanks of the 4th Tank Battalion arrived at dawn and cleared the field. By daybreak, crews counted 476 Japanese dead, most clustered in front of Company A's positions. And many defenders had blown themselves up with grenades once they realized the battle was lost. With only a dozen tanks on Tinian, the Japanese launched another massed effort at about 0330 on the 25th, using roughly half their available force. As the 23rd Marines tried to push them back north of Tinian town, they ran into a maelstrom of automatic weapons, anti-tank guns, bazookas, and rifle fire. 3 lead tanks somehow burst through the American wall of fire. A reporter described one flaming machine going scarlet in the light before careening off its tracks into a ditch, a second limping on and firing into the ditches, and a third desperately attempting to flee before being surrounded and blasted apart. A bazooka hit destroyed a 4th tank and killed its driver. Crewmen from other vehicles bailed out only to be quickly encircled and neutralized. One tank finally escaped but later caught fire and its crew perished. Parts of the Japanese 50th Regiment counterattacked the 2nd Battalion, 23rd Marines, only to be cut down by 37mm canister fire, scattered. Smaller enemy thrusts continued through the night, but they produced diminishing results. By daylight on July 25th, fewer than 100 Marines were killed or wounded, while roughly 1,141 Japanese bodies lay across the battlefield, with hundreds more believed to have been removed by their comrades. The Japanese defensive cohesion had effectively collapsed by the second day after the landings. Colonel Ogata had lost control of his forces amid severed communications, and it became only a matter of time before Tinian was secure, though isolated bands of fighters would continue. Sporadic night attacks for several days. Maritime and ground historians later noted that the 2 Marine divisions then advanced methodically south from White Beaches 1 and 2, systematically demolishing enemy fortifications, pushing the defenders aside and consolidating ground. Colonel Goodham McCormick, the 4th Division's intelligence officer, admitted they had expected a large, coordinated counteroffensive and braced for a bitter fight that, day by day, never fully materialized. Lieutenant Colonel William W. Buchanan, Assistant Naval Gunfire Officer, said their pattern was to clear every ravine and sector as they moved rather than simply driving down the main roads. A slow, linear brush beating method that was unglamorous but proved safest and most effective. The remaining resistance was gradually pushed to the island's fringes and then collapsed. But the work was far from easy. Marines were exhausted by heat, humidity, monsoon downpours, and the constant dangers of mines, booby traps, snipers, and ambushes from the jungles. Major General Watson's 2nd Marine Division moved in to assist the 4th in mop-up operations. The 2nd seized the northern airfields on July 26th, and after 2 days of work by the Seabees, those strips were ready to host Army P-47 Thunderbolt fighters. On the same day, the 4th Division climbed Mount Maga, forcing Ogata and his staff to flee their Mount Lasso command post, which the Marines captured without firing a shot. The southward drive resumed on July 27th with the 2nd and 4th Divisions arrayed in a skirmish line across the island. Opposition was light and casualties were low as the advance gathered momentum. To conserve dwindling ammunition, commanders suspended routine preparatory barrages and avoided wasting shells on positions the enemy had already abandoned. By dusk on the 29th, the Marines controlled the northern half of Tinian, though tougher pockets of resistance appeared as they pushed toward Tinian town amid torrential rains. An enemy probe was repulsed, and Japanese mortars and artillery continued to harass the 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines. Colonel Franklin A. Hart's 24th Marines, supported by divisional artillery and cruiser and destroyer gunfire offshore, were tasked with seizing Tinian town the following day. As the 24th approached, cave positions along the town's northern coast poured intense fire into the attackers until flame tanks were brought up to flush them out, and engineers sealed cave mouths with demolitions. By about 1400 on July 30th, much of Tinian town lay ruined and deserted. A solitary Zero sat on a crushed coral runway while the 25th Marines moved to secure Airfield No. 4 on the town's eastern edge, and elements of the 23rd dealt with lingering, small arms opposition. The 1st Battalion, 8th Marines relieved the 24th that night, and the 2nd Marine Division pushed eastward with good results until they ran into stubborn resistance. Pursuing an enemy group into a large cave, they killed 89 defenders and, with the help of a flame-throwing tank, knocked out 4 machine gun positions. The 2nd wrapped up its actions by 6:30 p.m. and prepared for the night. Americans now held roughly 80% of the island, but Major General Schmidt's late July 30th order to drive to the southeast coast, seize every Japanese position, and annihilate any remaining opposition proved easier to issue than to carry out. Some 500 men of the 56th Naval Guard and perhaps as many as 1,800 soldiers of the 50th Infantry were dug into caves, cliff faces, and a plateau in the island's southeastern sector, vowing to fight to the last for their emperor. To soften those positions, every gun on Tinian plus Dexy Corps artillery on southern Saipan shelled the enemy through the night of July 30-31. The next morning, Tennessee and California and the cruisers Louisville, Montpelier, and Birmingham opened a 75-minute bombardment that paused for 40 minutes, so 126 aircraft, P-47s, B-25s, and carrier TBF Avengers could make a 40-minute bombing and rocket strike, dropping some 69 tons of explosives. Gunfire then resumed for another 35 minutes. One historian estimated cruisers and battleships expended roughly 615 tons of ammunition that night. The 10th Marines fired about 5,000 rounds, and the 14th Marines some 2,000. A captured defender later described the pounding as nearly unbearable. The Japanese defensive setup was difficult to crack. Mortars and small arms raked Marines as they climbed steep, trackless slopes and choked vegetation. Tanks could not climb the worst inclines and struggled through minefields, while armored amphibians patrolled the shoreline to suppress hostile fire. A company-sized Japanese beach unit mounted a suicidal counterattack against the 1st Battalion, 24th Marines around 1,000, and was wiped out. The 1st Battalion, 23rd Marines ran into hard resistance, including a concealed heavy weapon that pinned them down until Shermans knocked it out. A hidden concrete bunker was found and its 20 occupants slain. Elsewhere, a crippled Sherman was captured by the Japanese and turned into an armored machine gun block before an American tank destroyed it. As additional battalions closed in and began climbing the plateau, the 1st Battalion, 23rd Marines, and a company of the 2nd finally reached the summit late in the afternoon. The rest of the 2nd Battalion and then the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines arrived and spent the night holding the high ground. Company commander Captain Carl W. Hoffman recalled that by the time they topped the plateau, there was too little daylight left to wire in proper defenses. Lay out interlocking fields of fire or set up the machine gun belts a good position required. The enemy probed repeatedly at dusk. With the night pitch black after Japanese repositioning, Marines grew jumpy and challenged anyone who moved, though, Hoffman noted, there were no tragic friendly fire incidents despite the tension. The pressure built into a full-scale coordinated banzai assault. Wave after wave hit a 37mm post, while canister blasted attackers at close range, and the dead piled up so that one gunner would fall and another immediately take his place. Soon the bodies in front of that emplacement reached nearly shoulder height, and by dawn, the Japanese attack had been driven off with hundreds of enemy dead around the perimeter. Hoffman, who carried a trumpet with him, later played to steady the men. During that quieting interlude, a lone banzai runner charged straight for the wire and was cut down by firing from many directions. Hoffman wryly remembered the man did not appreciate his music, but the musician resumed his little concert after the threat was dealt with. The Japanese continued sporadic attacks over the next 2 days and managed to cause some casualties, but they suffered vast losses in return. General Schmidt formally declared Tinian secure at 6:55 p.m. on August 1st, though isolated enemy pockets and lone holdouts, some unaware that organized resistance had ended, kept emerging or launching raids for months afterward. The final known holdout, Maruta Susumu, was not discovered until 1953. By then he was living on Tinian as a civilian worker for NKK, the island's large sugar company, rather than as a soldier. Tens of thousands of civilians had sheltered in caves during the fighting. Estimates suggest as many as 10,000, and only gradually trickled out, many unsure of their fate. Roughly 4,000 civilians are believed to have died during the campaign. Marines had watched in horror as people on nearby islands sometimes hurled themselves from cliffs out of fear of capture, though mass suicides were less common on Tinian. Some non-combatants moving near Marine lines at night were accidentally shot, and a few were forced into deadly situations by retreating Japanese who strapped explosives to them or pushed them off cliffs. On August 14th, Major General Clifton Cates's entire 4th Marine Division steamed back to its base camp in Maui. Fulfilling Cates's promise to his men, the division had suffered more than 1,100 casualties in the campaign, including 212 killed. Its next assignment was Iwo Jima, where it would suffer further losses, roughly 105 killed and 655 wounded in that later action, according to the account. The 2nd Marine Division remained in the Marianas until the end of the war. Of the roughly 9,000 Japanese defenders on Tinian, fewer than 400 are thought to have been taken prisoner. Almost all the rest were killed. Admiral Raymond Spruance later hailed the landing of some 42,000 men and their equipment across the narrow white beaches as the most brilliantly conceived and executed amphibious operation of World War II. Holland Smith concurred, calling it the perfect amphibious operation. Because of the work of the Amphibious Reconnaissance Battalion, the Marianas provided the Army Air Forces with bases from which to strike the Japanese home islands. Once Tinian fell, airfields there were about 1,200 nautical miles from Japan, well within range for the B-29's roughly 2,800-mile capability. 2 wings of the 20th Air Force were based on Tinian, and 3 months after its capture, B-29s were bombing the Japanese mainland. Air Force figures cited in the account report that during the following year, B-29s flying from the Marianas flew some 29,000 sorties and dropped about 157,000 tons of ordnance. Japanese sources later attributed to those raids roughly 260,000 deaths, about 2.2 million displaced people, and the destruction or burning of some 2.21 million dwellings. Tinian's place in military history was sealed when, on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay departed from the island and delivered the first atomic bomb to Hiroshima. 2 days later, a second nuclear strike was carried out on Nagasaki, and Japan formally moved toward surrender. As Richard W. Johnston recounts in the official history of the 2nd Marine Division, when word of the capitulation arrived, the men pictured the forbidding coasts of Japan that might have awaited them in the autumn and looked back at Tinian's clean, rocky shoreline where they had landed. Many concluded, as one Marine put it, that capturing Tinian had been a sound investment.